by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning and welcome to Sunday with Michael Portillo. As February wanes and the verges bloom with crocuses and daffodils, let us bring a dash of colour to your Sunday morning with arts, culture, political debate and world affairs. Liz Truss has told Americans that her premiership was thwarted by the Bank of England and the Office for Budget Responsibility. Kemi Badenoch has traded accusations with Henry Staunton, whom she sacked as chairman of the Post Office. David Neal, the independent chief inspector of Borders and Immigration, was told that he had lost the confidence of the Home Secretary James Cleverly. The reverse might have been more true after the minister failed to publish 15 of the inspector's reports. When the Speaker of the House of Commons broke all parliamentary precedent on Wednesday in the Gaza row, the clerk of the House publicly disagreed with him. Has the relationship between elected politicians and officials irretrievably broken down? That's my question for today's political panel. In a few days, voters in Rochdale will pick a new representative in Parliament. What was seen as a foregone conclusion as a victory for the Labour Party has been cast in doubt. As our domestic politics are now dominated by the terrorist attack on Israel and the war in Gaza, at least in areas with Jewish or Muslim populations, is there a possibility that George Galloway, who appeals strongly to Muslim electors, could become the city's Member of Parliament? I'll look at that with the pollster Matt Goodwin. More concerning news from the Royal Navy this week as it emerged that a test of the Trident nuclear missile failed for the second time in recent years. The Ministry of Defence insists that the nuclear deterrent remains effective. Is the government perhaps becoming a little too comfortable with failure? Would you launch a nuclear warhead if it might plunge into the sea close to you? A former Royal Navy officer, Rear Admiral Chris Parry, will offer his view. And speaking of nautical adventures, Stefan Kyriazis will be here later this hour to review Dear Octopus, a new play at the National Theatre which actually has nothing to do with the sea. But it's one of several productions that our resident theatre critic has taken in this week. All of that to come. But first, your news headlines with Pip Thompson.
A very good morning to you. It is 11:02. I'm Pip Thompson in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has been accused of harbouring extremists within his party, with the Labour leader saying it's time for him to get a grip. It's after Lee Anderson, the former deputy chair, was suspended from the party after he said the London mayor was controlled by Islamists. Sir Keir Starmer says Rishi Sunak's weakness allowed the MP to act with impunity. The Muslim Council of Britain is now demanding that the Tories launch an investigation into alleged structural Islamophobia within its ranks. Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden says it was right to remove the whip from Mr Anderson.
No, I don't believe that Lee Anderson is an Islamophobe, but words matter, and the choice of words that he used, the choice of words that he used was not appropriate. He was given the opportunity to apologise, didn't take that opportunity, and therefore the Chief Whip took the decision to remove the whip from him.
Another debate on Gaza will be held in the Commons after that chaotic vote on Wednesday. The SNP says it will take up the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle's offer of a meaningful debate on a new ceasefire motion. There was uproar after he allowed MPs to vote on a Labour amendment, leading to calls for his resignation. SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn says his party will seek to move the debate forward that will push Parliament to support what he describes as concrete actions. The UK launched another round of airstrikes overnight against Houthi targets in Yemen. In a joint operation with the United States, 18 sites were hit across 8 locations. The Ministry of Defence says precision-guided bombs were used against drones and launchers. It follows a surge in attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea. It's the 4th time the UK has been involved in strikes against the Iranian-backed group since mid-January. Donald Trump is another step closer to becoming the Republicans' presidential nominee. It's after he beat Nikki Haley in her home state of South Carolina, claiming 60% of the vote. It's his fourth straight primary win, despite being engulfed in legal problems.
An even bigger win than we anticipated, and I was just informed that we got double the number of votes that has ever been received in the great state of South Carolina. So that's pretty good. So it's a record ×2.
A local action group has won its fight over plans to house asylum seekers in Cumbria. Despite a serious housing shortage in the Milham area, 8 properties were earmarked for 40 migrants. It sparked backlash in the community, with police forced to increase patrols after one house was vandalised. In a letter seen by GB News, the Home Office has now ruled that the site is not fit for asylum seekers. Dean Myers from Milham Communication Action Group told us that it's a huge relief.
The community's just been totally confused. We didn't know who was actually coming into the HMOs. No one consulted us, and it just sparked a bit of anger, I think.
Junior doctors in England have returned to the picket lines for a second day. They're striking for 5 days in a dispute over pay. It's the 10th time they've walked out since March last year. Health Secretary Victoria Atkins is calling for more talks with the union, saying the British Medical Association refused to put the government's latest offer to its members. They're asking for a 35% pay restoration as a starting position. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now, it's back to Michael.
Thank you, Pip Thompson. The week began with an explosive spat in immoderate language between the Secretary of State for Business and Trade, Kemi Badenoch, and the sacked chair of the Post Office, Henry Staunton, following allegations by the latter in last week's Sunday Times. Badenoch didn't just reject those accusations, but went to the dispatch box in the House of Commons to accuse Staunton of spreading falsehoods and seeking revenge. She suggested that his sacking might also be linked to allegations of bullying. Later in the week, the government fired another official, David Neal, Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, who'd gone to the press after 15 of his reports remained unpublished by the government. He pointed out that our airfields were open to illegal immigrants arriving by private plane. James Cleverly didn't want that advertised, and so he gave him the push. As Liz Truss seeks to explain her failed premiership by blaming officials, is the relationship between elected politicians and their most senior public servants irretrievably broken? Do officials perhaps feel that they must save the public from those that they've elected? To answer, I'm joined by Alan Evans, who was a civil servant during 3 decades and once private secretary to me in a government department, Peter Franklin, a former political advisor, and Emma Webb, the founder of the Common Sense Society. Alan, let me begin with you. Let's do the old man routine first. It didn't used to be like this, did it?
No, it didn't. Now, you cited 2 examples, but I'd also point out that in recent years we've seen the removal or sacking of the Cabinet Secretary, Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, Head of the Foreign Office, the Permanent Secretary of Education Department. I might have missed more, but in the past, I think it's fair to say that ministers took more responsibility for policy failures than happens now. There's more often now the suggestion that the minister will look to blame the officials rather than take responsibility themselves.
I mean, Margaret Thatcher, rather spectacularly and sometimes unhelpfully, believed that we ministers had no right to move officials. I mean, the most extraordinary example was, you know, if we had information officers who were civil servants who were not doing a very good job for us, Margaret Thatcher wouldn't let us remove them. It's changed an enormous amount.
It has changed an enormous amount, and that example you give is a good one why it needed to change. But look, I mean, in my view, most civil servants, most officials do not have a political agenda. If they did, I'd argue that they would have gone into politics themselves. But what they do want and you'll remember this from your days as a Secretary of State, they want ministers who can give leadership, who are clear about their policy objectives and treat their civil servants with respect. What they don't like, and this may be coming out more, we've seen it a bit in the COVID inquiry, is ministers who are either indecisive, who are chasing after media headlines and seek to blame officials when things go wrong. And that, I think, has led to more being put in the public domain than would have happened in the past.
Well, let me challenge you on that a bit. I mean, another thing that has changed, it's now quite routine for retired civil servants to take to the media and to be highly political and highly critical of ministers, including the ministers that they used to serve. That has been another development. You know that question I raised a moment ago, is there a feeling in officialdom that they need to save people from the people they've elected?
I don't know if there's a set view in officialdom. Indeed, I don't think there is in the way you've put it, but undoubtedly more people are willing to criticise, and particularly, if you point out, people who've now left the civil service, and I find that rather regrettable, actually.
Emma, what do you make of this? I mean, first of all, it isn't good, is it? I mean, it's not a nice look to have ministers and public servants slagging each other off, to have former public servants going off and becoming political. What has happened, and is there a solution to it?
I think Sue Gray is a good example of that, actually. And from the perspective of the public, I think that the public see a situation where you have and actually Liz Truss pointed to this in her speech at CPAC, that you have a Conservative government, you may have all of the best special advisors in the world, you may have an excellent ministerial team, and yet somehow nothing substantial seems to change. We struggle to deport illegal migrants. We struggle to control our borders. And I think people see a situation where it almost looks as if the government can pull all the levers that they want, but they're almost detached. And so that, I think, adds to the appearance that the civil service must be frustrating the process in some way. And I think on top of that, what we're seeing in this breakdown between ministers and officials is a symptom of a cultural problem in that I think we're an individualist society, and we agree that individualism is a good thing to a degree, so long as you don't lose the duty and responsibility that goes along with that. And I think we've seen too many civil servants, former civil servants, who have lost that sense of the duty of public service. And I think that on the part of politicians and on the part of civil servants, in recognising that they have a very specific role to play in part of the overall ecosystem, and it's a specific and limited role, and that they have a duty to that. I think that to a degree there is a cultural problem, and that this is partially a symptom of that.
You raise Liz Truss, and she's complained about the Office for Budget Responsibility. I mean, it strikes me that ministers have created a massive rod for their own back here. Because they felt that they couldn't be trusted unless they had an independent set of statisticians giving a view from the sidelines, they now more or less allow the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is, of course, not elected, to dictate economic policy. Now, that isn't just officials taking over. That is because ministers, recognising that politicians were not trusted by the public, put themselves in that position. They created this monster, which is now giving them a great deal of difficulty.
And Liz Truss, actually, she mentioned the quangocracy. We have so many quangos, and actually the...
Who created the quangos? Ministers.
And Tony Blair, particularly, I think, has, in creating the Supreme Court, is one example of this, because that is a sort of aberration in our constitutional ecosystem, and actually the highest court in the country should be Parliament, and so that is an example of something that has disrupted the proper functioning of our democracy. And another example is the College of Policing, creating things like non-crime hate incidents, which are non-crime crimes that are then enforced by police officers. These quangos can't be held accountable because they're not accountable to the electorate in any way. And so I think we have a really... I think that this is it's not just a tit-for-tat spectacle for the public. I think it's also, it goes to the heart of the disenchantment with our democracy, because people feel that they can vote for whichever party they care to, but nothing ultimately will change because it's outside of the hands of the electorate, and that's dangerous, I think.
I think the quangos are the fault of ministers of various governments over a very long period of time, because ministers got the feeling that the public wouldn't trust decisions that were made by ministers, by elected people. I mean, this is a terrible irony. And that if they created bodies that were supposedly independent, the public would have more trust in the decision-making by those bodies, which is crazy, first because they're not accountable, and secondly because they don't remain independent for very long. Peter, you were around government quite recently. Did you witness this deterioration in the relationship between officials and elected people? I say elected people, not ministers, because, you know, it happened to the Speaker the other day as well.
It did. I think it's the Tolstoy quote that all happy families are alike, all unhappy ones are unhappy in their own way. And I think it very much comes down to personalities. Yes, there are systemic issues as well, but I think there's a lot of personalities being pushed forward by their parties into government. They're not really there to govern. They're there to emote. They're there to communicate. They're there to give vibes. And when parties, when Downing Street, when prime ministers start appointing ministers first and foremost on their ability to govern, then maybe we'll have a better relationship. And there's a lot of ministers, including the one that I work for, that are on the backbenches, that are...
You were with Greg Clark.
Greg Clark, hugely capable man. Why is he on the backbenches? Because his face didn't fit, and because, it's all about politics, it's all about giving an impression. But these people are supposed to be running the country. They're not there primarily because of comms.
Your point of view, then, is a very interesting one, because you've come quite recently from working with ministers, but you are putting the blame on certain sorts of minister.
I'm putting the blame on our culture of politics and the extreme centralisation of decision-making power in Downing Street as well. You know, they don't really care that much who is made Minister for Rubber Bands, because they're going to decide the rubber band policy in Downing Street anyway. They don't really put... the Chancellor is a big exception to that. But for the most part, ministers are there just as kind of nodes in a network whose only real decision-making centre is Downing Street itself.
Alan, you were probably quite cheered by what you heard. Well, that's to say, you know, that sounds like your point of view as well. But how do we begin to put this right? What can officialdom do, even if it has been faced with a series of disagreeable and recalcitrant ministers? What can officialdom do to put us back where we ought to be?
Well, as I said earlier, officials want to carry out what ministers' objectives are, and I do disagree with them that somehow there is an agenda within the civil service to undermine policy. Ministers set policy, and officials appreciate giving clear steers and clear guidance by ministers. Now, in answer to your question, I think it's incumbent on all civil servants to try and work to articulate the ways in which policy can be applied most effectively, but equally to challenge ministers if there are policies which are not feasible or not capable of being put into operation. And we've seen this over Rwanda. I mean, I think the problems with the Rwanda bill have been the fact that many civil servants have pointed out some of the practicalities of the difficulties of doing that. Now, in answer to your question, I think there does need to be a reset between the role, duty and responsibility of ministers to set policy and to take leadership, and for civil servants to carry out those orders as effectively as possible to deliver those wishes. And that probably will have to wait until after the election.
I think there's been a pretty good debate. I mean, some of the things that are not new, you mentioned indecisive ministers. There have always been indecisive ministers. You mentioned impractical policies. There have always been impractical policies. I mean, for example, the community charge was wholly impractical policy. I wrestled with it. It had to be abolished within a single parliament. So those things are not new. Maybe, as Peter says, the behaviour of ministers is new, but something has gone badly wrong. And the reason I've raised this issue today is I think it's absolutely very important. The country is not where it ought to be. Many thanks indeed to Emma Webb, Alan Evans and Peter Franklin. More politics after the break as we look ahead to the messy by-election in Rochdale with the pollster Matt Goodwin. so you don't get longer.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Britain's newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
When you listen to Nigel Farage's assessment there, do you feel that maybe this is as good as it was going to get, given that we had the pandemic and it was inevitably always going to be a bit of a mixed bag?
Well, I think it's a bit of a poor excuse from Nigel there that they haven't done it properly. The facts are, Nigel, that it's not worked. It's not going to work. Yes, we will rejoin. I mean, are we better off for it? Are they...
Can I jump in there, Charlie? We're going to rejoin under which government? Because Labour aren't going to do that, unless you don't think...
But I mean, it's going to be unavoidable not to join, because I think it's getting worse and worse for us. I mean, let me just say this. Are the NHS better because we're out of Europe? No, they're not, because they're not employing more staff. Is the building trade better off? No. Is travelling abroad or to the EU or staying in the EU, are we better off? No. Are we better off because foods rise because of the EU? No. Are we better off with imports and export? No, because they're taking longer. The overall result is that we're not better off. The killer point here is 57% of the public would now vote to remain. 33% would leave. Surely that's the telling point.
It depends on the pollster, Charlie, because we were talking to a very good pollster earlier who said there's no enthusiasm for any change in a year. Maybe 10 years, they might be thinking about it.
Belinda de Lucia, let's bring you in. I'm sure you want to react to what Charlie said.
I mean, who would have thought that the UK wanting to run its own affairs and making our politicians more accountable would be so revolutionary? EU Parliament voted a majority to get rid of the vetoes, the last remaining scraps of democracy that the EU had. Now, luckily for EU citizens at the moment, you know, it means a treaty change to actually go forward. But that is the mood. The ever closer union. We have dodged a federalised, globalist, international, power-gobbling, anti-democratic organisation, and that's worth more than a few trade and travel perks for a few wealthy people in this country.
Hear, hear. Belinda de Lucia, Charlie Mullins, great to see you both.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. An acrimonious by-election campaign in Rochdale will reach its denouement on Thursday, with the suggestion that George Galloway could be returned to the House of Commons for the first time in almost a decade. Galloway is appealing directly to the constituency's large number of Muslim voters on the issue of Gaza. His main opponent, Azhar Ali, was disowned by the Labour Party over comments that he made about the Middle East. Here to give us a sense of what to expect is the pollster and political commentator Matt Goodwin. Matt, welcome back to GB News.
Thanks, Michael.
Well, what should we expect in Rochdale?
Well, ordinarily, we would be expecting another big Labour victory, of course. This should have been fairly textbook for Keir Starmer after the recent by-elections, go into what was a Labour seat and win it comfortably. Instead, we're now looking at potentially the maverick insurgent George Galloway, and my instinct, I suspect he will end up winning this seat. He's got a very big Muslim vote, 30% of the seat is Muslim. He's campaigning specifically on the Gaza issue, and he's been very clear. He's saying to local voters, send me into the House of Commons and I will shake the walls over the issue of Gaza in Israel. So what this will probably end up doing, Michael, instead of helping the Labour Party, is turn up the volume on this issue of the Middle East politics and importing these grievances into the UK.
You talk about your instinct, but you are partly a pollster. Is there any polling?
There is very little polling, and constituency polling in by-elections is notoriously difficult. It's very hard to get an accurate measure. But if you assume that Labour vote is likely going to collapse, you assume that the Conservative vote is as weak as we've seen in recent by-elections, and I think on balance, Galloway's got a very good chance, particularly if he cements that Muslim vote, which he's clearly trying to do. And to be honest, Michael, look, I mean, I don't agree with George Galloway's politics, but he is a very good campaigner. I mean, if you look at his speeches, if you look at what he's been doing on the ground, you know, he's been, I think, outperforming everybody else.
I mean, just to challenge that for a bit, I've heard it alleged that in the constituency, because not everybody follows these matters as closely as we do, that many voters don't know that Azhar Ali has been disowned by the Labour Party. Yeah. And even if he has been disowned by the Labour Party, many people would say, so what? I mean, this is a local figure. They know him quite well. Yeah. He's going to appear on the ballot, by the way, as the Labour Party candidate. You can't stop that happening. Yeah. The second point of challenge is you talk about the Muslim vote. Yeah. But many people have been on this programme telling us that we could not regard that as a solid thing. Yeah. It's made up of thousands of individuals, some of whom care a lot about Gaza, some who care less about Gaza. But also, some of them, their reaction may be to vote for who they think is the Labour candidate, and others to vote for Galloway. I mean, so without polling, it's quite hard to make these assumptions.
It is, but you can guarantee that over the last few days, Galloway is going to be telling anybody and everybody what has happened with regards to Labour, and I think the people who don't know that Labour have backed off from their candidate will probably not end up voting in this by-election anyway. It will be the more engaged, aware voters who are participating. The other thing to say about the consolidation of the Muslim vote, well, if you look at where Galloway has campaigned previously, notably in areas like Bradford, that is exactly what he has tried to do, quite successfully actually, is drive a wedge really between British Muslims and other parts of the constituency and say, actually, you know, as he said this week, the people of Gaza don't have a vote in this by-election, but you do. That's what he's saying to people locally, right? So he's trying specifically to capitalise on that.
And why are you so pessimistic about what follows if he is elected? Why do you think that signals an intensification of the divisions in our politics and society?
Well, I think what we're seeing generally now in the country is an increase in the temperature, and it's very clear to everybody, I think since October the 7th, that what Britain has essentially done is, through mass migration over many years, has been importing conflicts from overseas, not just the conflict between Gaza and Israel, but also tribal conflicts from Yemen and Syria and parts of elsewhere in the world. And I think having somebody like George Galloway in the House of Commons is going to again be another symbol of the extent to which our politics has become much more sectarian, has become much more tribal. And I've, like many voters out there, Michael, I've been deeply alarmed by the events in recent weeks where, to be frank, we have seen a growing threat to members of Parliament, both physical and verbal. And I think the election of Galloway would symbolise that our politics is becoming much more influenced by a radical Islamism that is primarily motivated by what's happening elsewhere in the world.
You recently posted the following. Do not let the Lee Anderson comments distract us from what is the key point since October the 7th. We have a major problem, you say, with radical Islamism in Britain. Do not let the political and media class take us back to the ridiculous gaslighting that followed the murder of Sir David Amess. So let's just understand what you mean by the gaslighting that followed the murder of David Amess.
Well, what has tended to happen in the past, after the murder of Sir David Amess, after the Manchester Evening News bombings, after the comments, which I don't agree with, by the way, the comments from Lee Anderson over the last 24 hours, is that our national conversation basically focuses on everything and anything but the real issue. We're told that we should be nice to one another. We're told that it's about social media. We're told that it's about an irresponsible MP who Rishi Sunak needs to suspend. We're told that MPs are facing a growing security threat, but we're not told what that threat is. So let's be clear. What all of these things have in common is that they are all pointing to the growing threat within British society from an extreme radical Islamism. That's not to say we have a problem with British Muslims. It is to say that within the British Muslim community, as we know from the Shawcross Review, from polling of British Muslims, from the terrorist attacks that we've experienced over the last 20 years, that we have a serious problem. And by gaslighting, what I'm saying is after these attacks, after these events, after these interventions, what our media and political class tend to say is that, well, this is not actually to do with that issue. They fall over themselves to find any other potential explanation. It's about student activists on the radical left. It's about social media and the perils of Twitter and X. But actually, no, it's about radical Islamism. Every other European country is waking up to discuss this. Germany's talking about it. France is talking about it. Sweden's talking about it. Our political class seem incapable of saying the reason Sir David Ames was murdered, the reason our MPs feel intimidated, and the reason our democracy is being attacked in this way is because of a virulent radical Islamism.
By pure coincidence, because I didn't know you were going to make this point, I didn't even know we were going to discuss this point, I was reading a moment ago, you know, this morning's press, and it's not just the political class, it is also that the media doesn't want to mention this in many cases. For example, there is a story today that members of Parliament, 3 of them, have been granted protection. They've got, you know, drivers and they've got security teams because they're being intimidated. But no indication of who is intimidating them.
No. We've also had national commentators in prominent newspapers say that actually the source of this intimidation is sort of student activists on the left of politics, a bit like it was in the 1960s. So everybody is doing whatever they can to basically avoid the big fat elephant in the room, and that is radical Islamism, which is being emboldened by the radical left because it is obsessed with identity politics. It gives Islamists a free pass, and it is basically, I think, pointing to our broken model of multiculturalism. So what do you do, Michael? What would a different debate look like? Right, number one, we take the Shawcross Review seriously and we say the dominant security threat to our society is from radical Islamism. We need to deal with that. Number two, we have to dramatically lower migration because you cannot have successful integration while running mass migration. It's never worked before. Number three, we then, under controlled migration, need a serious policy that is going to encourage people to integrate into our ways of life and to share our values. The Danes are doing this. They're completely overhauling their education system. The Swedes are doing this. They're completely overhauling their housing and their approach to crime. The French have just decided they're going to deport foreign nationals who glorify Islamist terrorism. Michael, we're behind the curve. We need to draw a line in the sand. We should stop tolerating people who do not tolerate our way of life.
And just to draw this to a conclusion, if we are concerned about divisions in society, as we are, if you and I may feel concerned about the election of George Galloway, if that happens, can we also agree that the comments made by Lee Anderson are profoundly unhelpful if we're trying to bring people together?
Absolutely, and it's very unfortunate because what individuals like Lee Anderson and other people have in common, notably after October the 7th, is they play into the hands of people who don't actually want to talk about these issues. So I don't agree with Lee Anderson's comments, but I do think radical Islamism is the dominant threat to our way of life.
I am obliged to give you the full list of candidates standing in the Rochdale by-election on Thursday, as are Ali, who appears on the ballot as the Labour candidate, Mark Coleman, Independent, Simon Danchuk, Reform UK, Ian Donaldson, Liberal Democrat, Paul Ellison, Conservative, George Galloway, Workers' Party of Britain, Michael Howarth, Independent, William Howarth, Independent, Guy Otten, Green Party, Ravin Rodent Sobotna, Official Monster Raving, Looney Party, and David Tully, Independent. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you, Michael.
That could win. Thank you very much. Well, something a bit lighter after the break. Stefan Kyriazis will be in the studio to whip us through the latest theatre productions that are delighting or indeed confounding audiences.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Lee Anderson's Real World. Fridays from 7 p.m.
Dr. Jane Jones, who's the clinical lead for Care After Combat.
Yep.
Jane, thanks for coming. And just tell me a little bit about your organisation. What do you do?
OK, well, thank you for having me here so we can talk about Care After Combat. So we are an organisation, a charity, who work into the prison system, working with military veterans who've somehow got involved with the justice system and
So there's quite a high population of ex-servicemen and women in our prisons. Why is that, do you think?
So 2014, the government did a review of who was resident in UK prisons, and what they found were that military veterans are the highest occupational group, and this obviously raises some concerns. So the government wanted to do something about that, and so they supported Care After Combat initially just as a scoping exercise, really, to see if there was any way we could help these men and women actually, understand the problems that led to offending behaviour and go on to lead successful lives.
So what sort of offending behaviour are we talking typically for people that's in prison that's actually served in our armed forces?
Primarily, it's violence.
Yeah.
So that is the highest offence that we work with.
Okay.
But of course, the military, as with everybody else, it's the full range of offending behaviour.
OK, so we're in a pub, Jane, Dr. Jane, and I guess for some people, the odd tip of alcohol is good, a bit of fun of a weekend, relax, let your hair down. But for some people, alcohol is not always their best friend, and I guess that plays a part in some of your veterans that end up inside.
Absolutely. So speaking from my own experience, a good 2/3 of the people I work with have some kind of mental health problem or mental health difficulty, struggling to either adapt into civilian life or with some of the traumas they've experienced during service. People might self-medicate with alcohol to manage some of those thoughts and feelings.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Quotes, no one was hurt apart from the Royal Navy's reputation, end of quote. That was the verdict of one of Russia's main news shows after it emerged last week that a Royal Navy test of the Trident nuclear missile system had failed. There was mockery in other world media following the farcical tests in which the missile, Britain's only form of nuclear deterrent, plopped into the sea shortly after breaking the surface of the water. All this while the Minister of Defence, Grant Shapps, was on board to witness the procedure. Just how worried should we be about the state of the Royal Navy and the national nuclear deterrent? To answer that, I'm joined by former naval officer Rear Admiral Chris Parry. Chris, welcome back to GB News. I mean, this is a pretty wretched event, isn't it? How on earth can this have happened?
Well, Michael, we don't need to be worried about this. The test was designed to show that the missile could be programmed and ejected from the submarine, reach the surface, and that's really the end of the test. These are what I would call time-expired missiles. I call them crash test dummies. The test is not designed to prove the flight of the missile. It's just the ejection from the submarine itself. I understand there was an anomaly with the test equipment and the way the test was being conducted, and that's what caused the problem. So we don't need to worry about it. There have been over 190 of these tests with the Trident 2 D5 missile between us and the Americans, and they've all flown really well. And I have to say, it's pretty ironic that the Russians or anybody else takes the mickey out of us for it. They've had multiple failures with their ballistic missiles, so they're not in a position really to complain about ours.
Your figure of 190 is interesting, but in fact, the British have not had a successful test now since 2012. That's 12 years ago. And Chris, forgive me for saying this, you sound a bit as though you've got a line to take there. I mean, seriously, how can you say that the test was to see whether the missile could break the surface of the water? Was it not destined to fly thousands of miles?
Yeah, it could have flown thousands of miles. It didn't. I mean, jokingly, I could say it did hit its target, which was the sea. It just wasn't the sea in the place where they thought it would. The fact the missile flies to its pre-programmed target is an additional bonus to tell you the truth. What it proved is that Vanguard, after a 7-year refit, which is a bit more damnable to tell you the truth, can actually launch the real missiles, the ones that are serviced to a very high requirement and are not having test equipment hanging off them.
Well, I'm obviously not going to shake you in what you're saying. I mean, I would reflect as a taxpayer that we have invested a vast amount of our GDP in this system, and indeed we've distorted our defence spending in order to fund this system. And here is this very public demonstration of failure.
Michael, you've been a Secretary of State for Defence, and you know how the system works. This is not a failure of the submarine or indeed the system itself. As I said, when you've got the Rolls-Royce missiles in the tubes, they're going to fly, and the Russians and our opponents better believe that's the case. As I said, you know, when they've been test-fired with the up-to-date missiles, they've gone fine. And I've got no doubt. I mean, look, I'm an aviator. I don't like submariners. I wouldn't be here advocating on their behalf if I didn't believe this was the case.
Well, all right, moving a bit closer to aviation, we've also got 2 aircraft carriers, neither one of which has been able to leave port to join NATO operations. Another fantastic diversion of funds from the defence budget in general into the aircraft carriers. And at the moment, they're looking like pretty poor value, aren't they?
Oh, it's dreadful, Michael. I'm not going to defend the policy of actually putting 2 aircraft carriers to sea and not actually providing them with the requisite number of fighter aircraft. I'm afraid they're burning holes in the ocean at the moment, really not as aircraft carriers, but almost as helicopter carriers with a few jets on. If you look at Australia, which was scheduled to get 72 F-35s, they've already acquired 60. And we've barely got 8, and we have to borrow US Marine Corps jets if we want to deploy as a strike carrier. The whole program's an absolute disgrace in terms of the way the original concept was written. And I wrote the original concept, and we need to do something about it if we're going to restore our credibility. This is a national capability. It's a national disgrace that we can't get them to sea in good order. But I must stress that HMS Prince of Wales, that was at a month's notice in maintenance, was got ready for sea within a week by Portsmouth Dockyard and its ships company, and is even now leading a major maritime exercise, having replaced Queen Elizabeth. And that's why we've got 2 carriers instead of 1, that we can actually always have 1 at sea if we want to.
We don't have time just now to go into the question of how you defend the carriers, but I would just comment that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated that even nations without navies can sink important ships. But maybe we can review that another time. Chris Parry, thank you very much for joining me just now. After the break from submarines to cephalopods, Stefan Kyriazis will be reviewing the National Theatre's new play, Dear Octopus. Join me then.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
The Camilla Tominey Show. Sunday mornings from 9:30.
We had Grant Shapps on last week. He was talking about how defence spending is now creeping up to 2.25% of GDP. Ben Wallace's predecessor suggested it should be 3%. We hear that we've got the smallest army, I think, since the Napoleonic Wars. Numbers are down. There's a question as to whether we can staff frigates in the Red Sea. Why haven't we sent aircraft carriers? What's your impression of the situation?
Well, I don't think it matters how much you spend, it's how effectively you spend it. And we spend it very ineffectively. We have lots of scandals about defence spending. And I think partly because of the monopoly position of some of our defence suppliers, we don't get good value and we don't get reliability. This latest story in the Telegraph is that HMS Diamond, which is our ship, which is out there defending the Red Sea, doesn't have the capability of firing a missile from the ship to the land, so it can't participate in the attacks on the Houthis. So in order that we can participate in the attacks, we're flying RAF aircraft from Cyprus, which is a very long way away. When I was Defence Secretary, I ordered cruise missiles for our nuclear-powered, but not nuclear-armed submarines. And I think we have 6 or possibly 7 of those. But last autumn, it was reported that 5 of those were out of commission, were not available. We have about 21 aggressive surface ships. So we've got 2 aircraft carriers, then we've got frigates, and we've got destroyers. But at any one time, you can count on about half of those not being available because they're under refit or whatever. So we have a minimal surface fleet now. And for whatever reason, it doesn't seem that we're able to deploy a submarine to the area that can fire cruise missiles. Our 2 aircraft carriers, built at enormous expense, are sitting in Portsmouth.
Which seems to most people ludicrous,
Well,
at least with what's going on.
It doesn't seem ludicrous to me.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Theatre World is bristling with new productions, and here to review some of them is Stefan Kyriazis, a friend of the show with a lot to say about an enemy of the people, which I think is originally at least Henrik Ibsen, is it not?
It is, from like the 1880s, although this is a production that's been running in Berlin for actually years, it's more than a decade. It came over before in the original German. It's Thomas Ostermeyer's production, so it's very, very updated. They've twiddled lots of things around. It's very kind of zeitgeisty, so we've got a little clip of the stars talking about it to give you a bit of a flavour.
There's a lawlessness to it that I think feels theatrical for the West End.
This is a play which turns the mirror onto the audience and literally asks, why do you think what you think?
Really, it's a whistleblower story. It holds space for people to be able to speak and be listened to.
Steven Spielberg was inspired to write Jaws by this play. It's about the truth, and it's about how the truth can be corrupted.
So we saw in passing there that Matt Smith is in the lead role. How does he acquit himself?
Matt Smith is tremendous. The man is charismatic. He's very easy to watch. You instantly feel comfortable and you're very drawn in. And he's playing a much younger version than in the original play, but he's the doctor of a spa town, and he has discovered that the water is actually toxic, poisoned, most likely by the factories. And his brother is the mayor, and his friends are all kind of right-on journalists, and his father-in-law refers to all of them as kind of wokey-cokey liberals and all this sort of thing. So they're all outraged at first, and then the whole question of the play is, what would you do? And it's the whole idea of our kind of liberal morality that kind of maintains our society. What happens when the cold, hard facts kick in, and it would actually cost hundreds of millions to repipe the spa, and the whole town relies on the spa. And suddenly he has everybody behind him, and then everybody starts dropping away as the financial reality hits in. And it's pertinent, it's modern. They've thrown in references to the post office scandal, to our very rich prime minister, to billionaires taking joyrides to the moon while millions starve. It gets a bit kind of T-shirty, slogany. But the big gimmick of the play has always been that Act 2, Matt Smith's character wants to hold a town hall because everybody's turned against him. He wants to get his point out there. House lights come up. We become the town hall. He gives this incredibly impressive long rant that veers between kind of one of those people standing on Piccadilly Circus with a megaphone, but also kind of question time. And then it's thrown to the audience. What do we think?
Literally?
Yes, so the people that have all turned against him go, well, that's all very lovely, but, let's ask the people, come on, who out of you agrees with all this nonsense? And, of course, we all put our hands up because they're all lovely ideas about making things right and doing the right thing. And then the audience members are asked to justify their views or if they have anything to say.
What, literally, they get up?
Literally, microphones go around, people put their hands up. So, yes. And then most of us, I think, are fairly sure there's a fair few plants in the audience. but you also get the randomness. There were definitely people at the stage door I saw that had spoken up during. So it's going to depend on what people have got to say. Everyone was incredibly articulate the night I was there, and we got lots of comments about the state of the NHS, politics, deception, corruption, all these sorts of things. But I've heard that on other nights it can get a bit random, and it all just feels very. I guess it's meta upon meta upon meta. It's criticising us, kind of going, oh, well, yes, something needs to be done about that, but not right now, and not if it costs me anything.
Right.
But at the same time, seats are £195. Who can really afford to go and see this? The people that generally maintain the status quo to some extent. So it loses itself. The set is a blackboard, and they keep writing on chalk in it, which I find it's terribly self-aware, and then they whitewash the blackboard as he is slowly whitewashed out of being taken seriously. And it just feels a little bit, it's very didactic.
Yeah.
There's a lot of editorialising from the production.
OK, I think we understand that you're not all that keen on it.
No.
Do you want to take us on to another subject?
I want to take you to something gorgeous and glorious called Hades Town, which is a strange, weird, quirky musical that should not make sense, and yet I was absolutely in love with it by the end. And we've got a lovely little clip of it here as well.
Hades is a word for hell.
Yes.
And this is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice.
It is indeed. So we're set in kind of almost Great Depression, New Orleans, kind of. The music, as you can see, is jazz, spirituals. There's also quite a lot of kind of Celtic folk woven in as well. And it is literally the story of the young barman is Orpheus, a young drifter girl comes in, she's Eurydice, the host of the saloon bar is a kind of bustling mama, but she's Hermes. And they're on the side of the railroad to hell. So it's sort of real, not real, here, not here. It's the whole thing is about storytelling. It's about love. It's obviously about she gets taken into hell by Hades and he goes in to rescue her. And the whole thing, at the very end, when they fight for their love, is he can take her out as long as he doesn't look back to check that she's there, in which case she'll be kept there forever. So the whole story is propelled by this. And for a while I sat there going, I don't know if I really get this. It's not hugely, hugely tuneful. The music just wanders and plays and builds a little bit like the river. And then in my beautiful review, I'm like, it's a little bit like going under the river of the Styx. Slowly everything just ripples away. And there's very repetitive phrases, refrains. And for me, it was a little bit like opera, you know, where they repeat things and it sort of builds, or even storytelling by a fire. It's about the rhythm of it. And slowly...
And that's a good thing.
Yes, it's beautiful. And slowly you go under without even realising. The staging is gorgeous. Dancing is fantastic. And as it slowly builds and their love story builds and the singing is extraordinary, you suddenly feel you are really invested. And it's gorgeous. At the very end, they ask us to raise a glass to Orpheus and to all of us. And even though we know how the story will end, we're going to keep telling that story, and that's the beauty of it. It's our story.
Where can we see this thing?
We keep going. This one's on at the Enemy of the People, we should say, on at Duke of York until April. This one's on at the Lyric Theatre, and it's actually booking open at the moment. It's ongoing, so it's a lot of faith.
Booking through to December?
Yes.
So they believe it.
And the cheers from the crowd. And I just want to say, for me, Enemy of the People is going very much for young, crazy, let's make a change. But the crowd was quite old and respectable and wealthy. Hades Town is challenging, strange, all different sorts of music, big ideas. The crowd was young and they cheered all the way through it, this interesting, challenging, thoughtful musical. And I thought that, for me, was more exciting than Enemy of the People.
Nonetheless, I wonder whether they'll let me in. Have you briefly got
we do.
another
We also
production?
have something very soothing to please everybody at the end. We have Dear Octopus, which is on at the National Theatre at the Littleton.
Right. Now, tell us about this, because apparently it has nothing to do with the sea.
Well, the Octopus, it's Dodie Smith, who wrote 101 Dalmatians and I Capture the Castle. The Octopus is the family.
Yes.
It wraps us all in its tentacles, and we might struggle a bit, but ultimately we're happy to be brought back in. And it's, again, I started and I thought a little bit twee, a little bit posh, little bit kind of cosy nostalgia. But Dodie Smith is a wonderful writer, and there's a kind of steel punch inside this velvet glove. Lindsay Duncan is the lead as the matriarch Dora, and there's all these beautiful insults couched in her beautifully calm delivery. But slowly we get to know all the family, and again we come to love them. First, the Second World War is just looming over the shoulder, so we get that sense of menace. But it's timeless. It's about family ties that bind, the fear that the family is slowly fracturing in what was then modern times, but also about ageing. There's so much talk, and you could really feel the audience lean in with Dora, especially, and her husband, want to talk about what they've learned and how they've come to peace with growing older, and also enduring love. And the real message is the joy and the happiness is in the small things. The husband was going to go for great glory and great fame and a political career, but actually he eventually just learned that the smaller things that his wife potters around doing, there's a real power in that. And there's an absolute power in the writing. So again, it's a little bit subversive. It starts off and you think, this is a little bit twee. And everybody was absolutely gripped by the end. It's gorgeous, glorious, classy set, beautiful staging, highly recommended.
Where do we see it?
This one's on at the Littleton Theatre, which is at National Theatre until the end of March.
Littleton at the National Theatre until the end of March. So you've given us two that you thoroughly recommend and one that you're a bit iffy about.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Well, thank you very much again, Stefan. Now, that's all we have for the first hour, but please stay with me. The programme in the second part is going to review the grim but very important second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. A panel of journalists and refugees will join me in a few minutes' time. You are watching Michael Portillo on GB News, Britain's news channel, and we move now to hear what is the latest on our weather.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good morning, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest GB News weather. We've got some heavy rain across southern parts of England and Wales today, turning quite windy as well, but brighter for many of us. This morning a mixed picture. We've got the heavy rain across parts of Devon, Cornwall, southwest Wales, slowly pushing its way eastwards through the day. Elsewhere, some mist and fog to start with, but this should lift and break, and then there'll be plenty of sunny spells, particularly across parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland. A few showers possible here and perhaps northern England later, but the winds will increase across southern coastal counties of England, perhaps Wales too. Gales for some. Outbreaks of heavy rain could lead to some localised flooding. Temperatures near average for the time of year, so in any sunshine, not feeling too bad further north. As we go through into the evening time, we'll see the heavy rain continue, perhaps transferring more into southeastern areas, with the rain becoming lighter across the southwest. Elsewhere, clear spells, temperatures dropping below freezing under the clearest skies in Scotland, holding up under the cloud and the strengthening wind further south and east. So a grey start to Monday here. Outbreaks of rain generally holding on across the far southeast, but eventually clearing later on in the day. Elsewhere, a bright day, mixture of sunny spells, scattered showers. Best of the sunshine across the north and the west of the UK. Quite a keen northeasterly breeze for parts of England, particularly near the coast, which will make it feel quite chilly for the time of year. Temperatures on face value generally near average for the time of year.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. Weekdays from midday.
Chris, what is the preferred way in which the police go about their business at the moment? There's these two strands of thinking: evidence-based policing versus bobbies on the beat.
It's very, very difficult. The problem that police have got, basically, is that they're too thinly spread, and it's too much is expected of them. There's a long list, isn't it? Every month we hear police need to do more about this, police need to do more about that, and police do their best. They're overwhelmed with bureaucracy. I mean, when I was a young PC, if I took a shoplifter in, then I'd be in and out within an hour. You take a shoplifter in now, and you're doomed for the rest of your shift for 6 or 7 hours dealing with the bureaucracy. Police want to get back in those communities because community policing is really the core of policing. But such are the demands on their time at the moment and the bureaucracy and the fact that they are struggling now to retain experienced officers. People are hemorrhaging out of the police and new recruits coming in haven't got that experience, and there's a good chance they may not stay anyway. So there's all sorts of problems. And for the Home Secretary to glibly say he wants more done, frankly, clearly shows he's got no understanding of the pressure police are under. And of course, the constant criticism that they face across the board. Very rarely do you actually hear of police officers getting praised for acts of bravery or acts of compassion. So there's a problem with morale in the police force and clearly a problem with the Home Secretary who needs to get out there and talk to officers on the front line who frankly are struggling. And last night, of course, was a graphic example.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon and welcome to the second hour of Sunday with Michael Portillo. This weekend marks 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Although the war began with the Russian seizure of Crimea in 2014, the pictures of convoys of Russian tanks streaming across the border in February 2022 shocked the globe. The ferocious Ukrainian resistance that beat back those forces inspired the free world. As Ukraine's defence is thwarted today by a shortage of ammunition supplied from its supposed allies, I've invited 3 people, a war reporter, a Ukrainian journalist and an activist, to reflect on the course of the war and its future. Inside Russia, the war resulted in even harsher repression against political and cultural opponents of Vladimir Putin. It seems surprising, then, that a movie about a Russian dissident who thumbed his nose at Stalinist censors should be selling out in cinemas across the country. The adaptation of Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita was completed before the invasion of Ukraine, and the government has reluctantly allowed it to be shown. I'll discuss the significance of the movie and the original book with a biographer of Bulgakov at Oxford University. Later this hour, we'll hear how a community organisation in Yorkshire is helping to relieve social isolation amongst the county's older people. And I'll speak to a scientist about the latest moon landing, the first to be carried out by a commercial company. All of that to come, but first, your news headlines with Pip Thompson.
Thanks, Michael. Good afternoon. I am Pip Thompson in the GB Newsroom. The Prime Minister has been accused of harbouring extremists within his party, with the Labour leader saying it's time for him to get a grip. It's after Lee Anderson, the former deputy chair, was suspended from the party after he said the London mayor was controlled by Islamists. Sir Keir Starmer says Rishi Sunak's weakness allowed the MP to act with impunity. The Muslim Council of Britain is now demanding that the Tories launch an investigation into what they say is alleged structural Islamophobia within its ranks. Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden says it was right to remove the whip from Mr Anderson.
No, I don't believe that Lee Anderson is an Islamophobe, but words matter, and the choice of words that he used, the choice of words that he used was not appropriate. He was given the opportunity to apologise, didn't take that opportunity, and therefore the Chief Whip took the decision to remove the whip from him.
Another debate on Gaza will be held in the Commons after that chaotic vote on Wednesday. The SNP says it will take up the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle's offer of a meaningful debate on a new ceasefire motion. There was uproar after he allowed MPs to vote on a Labour amendment, leading to calls for his resignation. SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn says his party will seek to move the debate forward that will push Parliament to support what he describes as concrete actions. The UK launched another round of airstrikes overnight against Houthi targets in Yemen. In a joint operation with the United States, 18 sites were hit across 8 locations. The Ministry of Defence says precision-guided bombs were used against drones and launchers. It follows a surge in attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea. It's the 4th time the UK has been involved in strikes against the Iranian-backed group since mid-January. Donald Trump is another step closer to becoming the Republicans' presidential nominee. It's after he beat Nikki Haley in her home state of South Carolina, claiming 60% of the vote. It's his 4th straight primary win, despite being engulfed in legal problems.
An even bigger win than we anticipated, and I was just informed that we got double the number of votes that has ever been received in the great state of South Carolina. So that's pretty good. So it's a record ×2.
An action group has won its fight over plans to house asylum seekers in Cumbria. Despite a severe housing shortage in the Millom area, 8 properties were earmarked for 40 migrants. It sparked backlash in the community, with police forced to increase patrols after one house was vandalised. In a letter seen by GB News, the Home Office has now ruled that the site is not fit for asylum seekers. Dean Myers from Millom Communication Action Group told us it's a huge relief.
The community's just been totally confused. We didn't know who was actually coming into the HMOs. No one consulted us, and it just sparked a bit of anger, I think.
Junior doctors in England have returned to the picket lines for a second day. They're striking for 5 days in a dispute over pay, this being the 10th time they've walked out since March last year. The Health Secretary is calling for more talks with the union, saying the British Medical Association refused to put the government's latest offer to its members. The BMA is asking for a 35% pay restoration as a starting position, but says it's open to negotiations. For all the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now, it's back to Michael.
Thank you very much, Pip Thompson. On the morning of the 24th of February 2022, the world woke up to see Russian tanks and soldiers streaming into Ukraine as a full-scale invasion began. Although the attack had been anticipated, it was nonetheless a shock to see rockets landing in Ukrainian cities, thousands of troops marching along Ukraine's roads, and civilians fleeing en masse. Against the odds, Ukraine managed to stem the invasion and turn the Russians back from around half the territory that they had occupied. But now the war is bogged down in an attritional contest that favours Russia with its enormous supplies of artillery and of soldiers regarded as expendable by the Kremlin. To reflect on how Ukraine has changed in 2 years of full-scale war and whether it can still win, it's my pleasure to be joined by Ukrainian journalist at The Spectator magazine, Svitlana Morinets, Ukrainian activist Maria Romanenko, and the British conflict reporter who spent time on Ukraine's front lines, David Patrick Karakos. Welcome to all of you. David, let's start with you. What is your view of the position on the front line now?
So I've been going to Ukraine for 10 years, but critically just after the all-out invasion last year, and there has been a change. On the front lines, troops remain very motivated. There is a clear understanding of what happens if Ukraine loses. This is existential. It's an overused word, but in this sense, it really is clear. They know what's coming. We're dealing with a Putin, a dictator who believes that there is no such thing as Ukraine. The Ukrainians are merely confused Russians. So the men on the front line, the men and women on the front lines remain committed. But there are problems. There are problems with the supply of weapons. They haven't come in the right time and they're incomplete. There's also issues around Russian defences. The Russians have mined We're talking thousands of miles of mines here. It's almost impossible to break through without a serious uptick in the sophistication and quantity of weapons. As you mentioned as well, the Russians benefit from what I call the despot dividend. Putin is a despot. No one is going to push back on him. He can send wave after wave of Russian troops to their death. When I was in Bakhmut, the Ukrainian soldiers talked about meat waves. The Russians would just come at them. They'd gun them down with their artillery, but they would keep coming. So the situation is tough. Those who joined up after the all-out invasion are the most motivated. Now you're getting waves of conscripts. These are people who still want to fight, but they don't have adequate training often. We're talking about people being sent out after 5 weeks of training. In World War II, we sent people, even at the most desperate of times, with 22 weeks training. So the position is tough. They're facing serious challenges, but I want to make clear that, Ukraine still resists. The people are still holding out, and they all understand what is coming if they lose.
Svetlana, as a Ukrainian, would you like to comment on that? And would you like to comment on the importance of the supply of weapons from allies?
Of course, because right now the situation is awful. Russians took Avdiivka, the Ukrainian city that had 30,000 people living before the war there. And now there is almost no one left. The city was burned down. And this week they have been advancing further. So their offensive hasn't stopped. And the main problem is that the Ukrainian soldiers, they don't have enough artillery to fight back. Per day, our soldiers use up to 2,000 artillery shells, and Russia uses 10,000. So, of course, we are in a big disadvantage, and we have this situation when our allies, when they wait for big dates to announce the aid for Ukraine. For example, yesterday was the second anniversary of the full-scale invasion, and then they wait till that day, and they announce, okay, we are going to send some weapons to Ukraine. But from the moment they announce it and to the moment that those weapons actually get the front line, it's a very long time. But they are needed right now. And we have the situation that Ukrainian army need more people, and conscription is going on, but people are afraid to join because they know that they won't have what to fight with. And that's the real problem. How do you motivate people if they knew that the army has a lot of supplies and they will get the training and they will have the weapons, artillery, everything, drones, then they would be more keen to go to the front line.
Yes, one thing leads to another. Let's just break it down a little bit. I mean, at the moment, the supply from the United States has completely frozen. I think nothing has been supplied since December. And people, thinking about what would happen with the Trump presidency. But actually, the Trump presidency, in a way, is now, because he's already paralyzed the House in the United States. What about weaponry from the Europeans? The Europeans recently confirmed a pretty big package. Is that arriving, and is it effective?
Yes, arriving, but our defense minister today told that 50% of the weapons announced arrive with a big delays. For example, the ammunition that was promised by EU countries to Ukraine, they promised 1 million shells till March, but only half arrived so far, and March is in a few days. But recently, for example, Denmark, they announced that they're going to give all the artillery shells that they have to Ukraine. And they said that other countries should follow the same because the EU has the weapons in their stockpiles. They don't use them. They keep them for the later. Maybe something happens, but they are needed right now in Ukraine. And maybe it would be much better if Ukraine receives them now. And then for them to replenish their resources, they would count on production of weapons in their countries,
Yes. Because even if there is a future threat against other countries, they're not threatened at the moment, so they can give out their stockpiles in that respect. And worth remembering that Rishi Sunak announced, I think, a £250,000 programme of producing shells. Maria, let's say something about the effect on the people in Ukraine. I mean, by now, the war must have affected almost every family in Ukraine, is that so?
Yes, I think every single Ukrainian either knows somebody who was killed or injured. It's either a family member or a friend of a friend that was killed or injured by Russia. And the mental health impact is obviously huge. All of us, no matter where we are, we wake up, we check the news, what's been bombed, if our friends and family are alive. It's a very, mentally, it's very, very challenging as well.
What should be the position of other countries towards refugees from Ukraine? Because the first announcements were made welcoming refugees from Ukraine were made in the context that we thought the country was going to be overrun. We believed the Russian propaganda. We thought that Ukraine would fall straight away. In fact, of course, most of Ukraine is not at the front line, even though missiles can fall anywhere. So what is the attitude? What's the attitude in Ukraine to people who've left the country? Do they feel that these people ought to come back and be part of the national effort?
Well, I think we will be coming back because, well, firstly, that's the position of, say, if we're talking about the UK, that's the position of the UK government and Ukrainian government. And the Ukrainians that I know, they do want to go back. It's the question of, you know, when they go back and what they go back with, because what happens in the UK, for example, is that Ukrainian war refugees, they come here with like 10, 20 years of experience in marketing, finance, education, and they come here and the language provision by the government is not enough. It's 5 hours a week, and they're not able to go up a couple of levels of English in order to get customer-facing job in their fields. So what happens is de-skilling. So, and I think that's bad both for the UK and for Ukraine, because in the UK, that means they can't get highly qualified jobs. They can't pay back into the UK economy much. And also, when they return to Ukraine, they not even they, you know, they lose their skills in terms of their fields, but they also will their English won't improve, and they'll go back without having gained anything. And I think that's quite sad. So I hope that the government will look into increasing the language provision. I know that some local authorities are working on that.
David, is this war effectively in the hands of the United States?
Unfortunately, I think yes. You know, it's a tale of two malignant clowns, one in the Kremlin, one in DC. And I really want to make this point, and this is not platitudinous. What is being fought out on the battlefields of Ukraine is not just about Ukraine and Russia. It is about Europe. It is about the West. If Ukraine had folded within 3 days, like Putin's lickspittles told him it would, he would be in Moldova by now. He would be in Georgia by now. Abriban, the Israeli statesman, once said, it's our experience that leaders do not always mean the opposite of what they say. Putin was very clear about what he wanted to do, and he remains clear. Now, I get it. For a country like Britain, people might think, well, why should we be paying for this? We have our own issues. But if we don't stop him now, we will pay more later. That much is clear enough. So it is vital that the West, if America does become isolationist, if Trump does on the first day, that if he does indeed take office, cut that funding, that we step up to keep Ukraine afloat, because it is in all of our interests.
You do well at understanding the mentality of different countries. You've shown some insights into Russia and insights into Ukraine. Give me an insight into the United States. I mean, what you've just said is so absolutely blatantly obvious to me. How can it not be obvious to the American political class?
I know, it is extraordinary, and I spend a lot of time in the United States. My brother is American. I think we're talking about such internal dysfunction. Look, the American political system, our system, look, we may pass stupid stuff, but at least we pass stuff. It's sort of geared toward gridlock in many ways. And what you have here is a man who the Republicans are terrified of. You know, this is a man, as you say, who, in a sense, is paralyzing things already. He's not even in Congress or the Senate. America appears to be retreating inwards. It appears that people in America are more interested in, quote-unquote, owning the libs than actually moving their country forward. But we have to understand, I've always said, Ukraine is the conflict of our age, because in it, you see all the things that are forming our age. EU timorousness, American dysfunction, Russian aggression. Look at this alliance now you're seeing of sanctioned states. North Korea is providing Russia with shells. Iran is getting involved. I've been attacked by Iranian Shahed drones in Odessa, in Kiev, and also indeed in Israel. So we see this alliance of sanctioned states growing. And make no mistake, we often call them an axis of resistance. That's overwrought. They're not really an axis. Nothing really binds them together ideologically except this desire to punch holes in the Western-led, US-led order wherever they can. And in that sense, Ukraine is a front in this war, and we need to defend it.
Svetlana, do you find it sort of personally devastating to see the United States paralysed in this way? I mean, at the beginning, the signs were very good, weren't they, that the United States was going to support Ukraine. Could you have foreseen, and how do you feel now, about the fact that the weapons from the United States have dried up?
Of course, it is devastating, and especially hearing Donald Trump saying that if he wins the election, he will end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. And our President Zelensky, he was saying, okay, I'm going to bring Trump to the front line, and he will see for himself if it is possible to end the war so fast. But also, Putin recently said that stop helping Ukraine, and the war will be over in 1 week. He didn't mean any peace agreement. He meant that he will take over Ukraine completely. And I think that is what US doesn't understand or Trump doesn't want to hear. Maybe they don't care enough. They think, okay, Ukraine will be occupied, the war will be over, and they can move on with their lives. But Ukrainians won't be able to do that, and we know all the horrors that Russian occupation brings, and it deprives our freedom. We won't be allowed to speak our language, to praise our culture, and all of that. So we don't have other choice but keep fighting, and everything depends right now on how US decides if they're going to send us aid or not.
Maria, I described you as an activist. Do you want to tell us now why the world should be supporting Ukraine?
Well, I very much agree with what David said, that it's a question of not just Ukraine against Russia. It's a question, I would also put it in democracy against dictatorship. And we should all stand on democracy's side because democracy is the only sustainable form of governing countries. So that's pretty obvious to me. I would also like to add that it's also very worrying, continuing what Svetlana said, that about how journalists get treated in occupied areas and what future holds for the areas that get occupied by Russia, is that my friend Max Levin was killed by Russia in early couple of weeks of the full-scale invasion. Then my friend Victoria Roshina, my former colleague, was kidnapped. That's what happens to everyone who becomes part of this Russian world. And it's also very sad to see when British journalists, instead of supporting democracy, actually spread lies and that favor Russian propaganda on Twitter and other platforms. So I hope that people realize that this is not what it seems to know. If they go to those occupied areas, they'll see what happened to people like me, my friends, my former colleagues.
The Ukrainian people made a decision to be part of the democratic and Western world, and that is a decision that we should respect and defend. Thank you very much to Svetlana Moronets, Maria Romanenko and David Patrick-Kodakos. After the break, we'll switch to Russia, where a new movie about a Stalinist dissident is proving very popular despite Putin's repression. Thank you all.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on this Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Lots of people very concerned about what's happening in the Middle East. Iran obviously denying it, but the next move from the United States, our key allies, will be absolutely key.
Absolutely right. And I think there's a lot of talk about where this could go, whether the situation could be escalated. But I think the chatter is heading in the right direction, which is about de-escalation. So if there are going to be targeted sanctions against Iran, that's already happened through expelling certain diplomats and other measures there. But you can do that without arm-to-arm combat at this stage. But I think the US will be weighing up all of its options. Antony Blinken obviously gave a press conference in the United States yesterday to say that, there will be a response from the US, but it'll be at their time and it'll be in the way in which they think is the most appropriate. So all eyes are now on the United States as to when it makes that move.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, isn't it, how domestic politics plays so much into international politics. The States, they've got a presidential election this year. We've got a budget coming up. So all the noise, both sides. You've got Donald Trump saying, go a bit more hawkish, I suppose you could say, than President Biden. And here we've got all the generals. We've got the Secretary of State for Defence coming out saying we need conscription, we need more cash. But a lot of that is part of the sort of national narratives rather than actually looking at what's happening in Iran, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it plays into, the very uncertain times that we're living. And you're absolutely right. There'll be supporters of Donald Trump who are clearly adversaries of Joe Biden to say we must act now. It's a demonstration of showing your strength. Opponents of Biden will say that the US looks weak if it doesn't take action now against Iran, who are clearly, as we know, funding these at arm's length organisations like Hezbollah in Tehran, like the Houthis who are carrying out the attacks in the Red Sea. So Iran is responsible.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Welcome back. The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov is a stinging satire on the Stalinist repression that squeezed the Russian author throughout his career. The book's themes are readily applicable to Vladimir Putin's Russia today. And for that reason, it was expected that a movie adaptation of the book, which was shot before the current invasion of Ukraine, might have been banned in Russia. However, having invested money in the project, it seems that the Russian government couldn't bring itself to censor it. And it's been viewed by packed-out audiences in Russian cinemas for the last month. Let's take a quick look.
Вы писатель?
Угадали. А вы? Ангел.
Скорее ведьма. И что же вы пишете?
Есть одна новая задумка, но она обречена.
Как получилось, что реакционная пьеса «Пилат» добралась до публикации и потом до постановки?
Кого ты имел в виду под персонажем Воланд?
Воланд?
Дьявол, в которого никто не верит, решает лично посетить Москву.
Well, it looks spectacular and beautifully shot. Joining me to discuss the significance of Bulgakov's work is Julie Curtis. She's Professor of Russian Literature and a Fellow of Wolfson College in Oxford. She's written 2 biographies of Bulgakov, which have been translated into 7 languages. Welcome, Julie. Great to see you on GB News. So let's understand, first of all, a bit about the book. When was it written, and broadly speaking, what themes does it pursue?
Well, Bulgakov wrote the book in secret in the last 10 years of his life, starting from the end of the 1920s, and then he completed it in 1940. And as he wrote it, he began to realize very quickly that there was no chance that it would be published by the Soviet authorities as the terror began to impose itself and socialist realism was imposed. And his widow, after his death, kept the manuscript in secret. And it was only published for the first time partially in the late 1960s, and then fully for the first time both in Russian and almost immediately in other languages, including English, in 1973. It's a novel which is completely original for its time. It combines extraordinary different layers of narration, so there's simultaneously the very amusing arrival of Volan the devil with his talking black cat and his retinue in Moscow to see what Moscow is like now that it's an atheist society. There's the story of the master and his lover, Margarita. And there's the novel that the master has been writing, which is a retelling, a kind of fifth gospel about the encounter between Christ and Pilate. And all of these 3 layers come together in a very complex text, which is both very amusing. It makes a tremendous attack on the literary establishment and the idea of complete state control of culture. And it also becomes a very moving love story and has powerful spiritual significance. And so it burst as a kind of bombshell on the late Soviet cultural scene in the early 1970s, just as this new film is also making waves in Putin's Russia.
OK, tell us what you know about the film. I don't know whether you've had an opportunity to see it, but tell us who made it and when.
I haven't had an opportunity to see it because although it was a jointly funded American and Russian production, the American distributors had to pull out, I think, for sanctions reasons. And so it hasn't been shown outside Russia, except I gather, I think actually 2 days ago in Berlin in the Russian Cultural Center. But they're trying to work out how they're going to be able to release it in the West, which I hope they will, because it's been a massive success and clearly it's a fascinating text. It's made by a director called Michael Lokshin, who is a US citizen. He spent much of his youth and education in Russia, but has lived in the West more recently. And he made the film of this novel in Russia, but using both Russian actors and foreign actors. And it was completed towards the end of 2021, so a few months before the invasion of Ukraine. He's now back in California. And since the invasion of Ukraine, he has made perfectly clear his abhorrence of Russia's actions in Ukraine. He's called upon the war to stop. And so it's been very controversial because he is an he's an anti-Putinist director, and yet he's created this film, which is such a success.
And how do you explain what's going on? I don't know whether you're a Kremlinologist or not, but how does one explain that the Russians have allowed this extraordinary film to be released and to be seen already by 3.5 million people in the circumstances?
I think it's actually well beyond 4 million now, actually, as of yesterday's figures. Yes. It's a complicated story. I think it's partly because, as you say, they actually invested in the film, and so there's a practical economic issue. The pro-Putin propagandists from Russia Today and the evening talk shows have been furiously calling for action against Lokshin. He's a terrorist. He should be charged with treason, although of course he can't because he's an American citizen. But the establishment hasn't moved on this, and there are certainly stories that the very powerful Vladimir Medinsky, who's the Minister of Culture, has seen the film and likes it. And so they're very torn, I think, as to whether they should be seen to clamp down on this as well, which I think would antagonize an enormous number of people who would like to see it, or whether they should go through the motions of seeming to tolerate something which, at least by analogy, offers very savage criticism of the state control of culture and totalitarian rule.
It's said that amongst the audience, a fair division has been witnessed, with parts of the audience rising at the end of the showing, applauding, and by implication, other parts of the audience not rising to applaud.
I think that the rising to applaud may be a question of whether they're happy with the interpretation. I mean, I gather that the film is very creative and inventive, which is as it should be. For such a complicated text, you need to do something different in film. You can't just reproduce it in its entirety. That wouldn't work. So I think some people may be dissatisfied with differences in interpretation. But for the moment, it's an enormous success. People are flooding to see it. And I think it will go on sending out its message of a challenge to the idea that people should just obey what the authorities tell them to do. What's happening in Russia today is that Putin is recreating the Stalin-era system of total control of culture, which is then instrumentalized to shape people's opinions about everything in their lives. And he is banning everything which doesn't echo that message. So this is very unusual, but it's again an echo of the original publication of Master and Margarita in what was still Soviet Russia, which was also extraordinary for a text which addresses religious issues, for example.
And let me utter a paradoxical sentence. Let us hope that the film that is being seen in Russia today will be seen in the West before too long. Thank you very much, Julie Curtis. Soon we'll be soaring into space as the scientist Andy Lound explains the significance of the first American lunar landing in half a century. Before that, and very down to earth, your news headlines with Pip Thompson.
Yes, back here on Earth. It is 12:31. I'm Pip Thompson in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has been accused of harbouring extremists within his party, with the Labour leader saying it's time for him to get a grip. It's after Lee Anderson, the former deputy chair, was suspended from the party after he said the London mayor was controlled by Islamists. The Muslim Council of Great Britain is now demanding the Tories launch an investigation into alleged structural Islamophobia within its ranks. Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden says it was right to remove the whip from Mr Anderson.
No, I don't believe that Lee Anderson is an Islamophobe, but words matter, and the choice of words that he used, the choice of words that he used was not appropriate. He was given the opportunity to apologise, didn't take that opportunity, and therefore the Chief Whip took the decision to remove the whip from him.
The SNP says it will take up the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle's offer of a meaningful debate on a new Gaza ceasefire motion. There was uproar after he allowed MPs to vote on a Labour amendment last Wednesday, leading to calls for his resignation. SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn says his party will now push Parliament to support what he describes as concrete actions. The UK launched another round of airstrikes overnight against Houthi targets in Yemen following a surge in attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. In a joint operation with the United States, 18 sites were hit across 8 locations. It's the 4th time the UK has been involved against strikes against the Iranian-backed group since mid-January. Donald Trump is another step closer to becoming the Republicans' presidential nominee. It's after he beat Nikki Haley in her home state of South Carolina, claiming 60% of the vote. It's his 4th straight primary win, despite being engulfed in legal problems. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Michael will be back after this short break.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Patrick Christie's Tonight. Weekdays from 9 p.m.
Former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has made her much-anticipated appearance before the Scottish COVID inquiry today. It comes after allegations emerged that she deleted key pandemic WhatsApp messages, used the pandemic to push her own political agenda. But let's just cast our mind back, shall we, to August 2021, when Sturgeon was asked if she'd hand over all her WhatsApps to the inquiry. Here we go.
I think if you understand statutory public inquiries, you would know that even if I wasn't prepared to give that assurance, which for the avoidance of doubt I am, then I wouldn't have the ability. This will be a judge-led statutory public inquiry.
Which, for the avoidance of doubt, I am. OK. Well, you weren't, were you? But fast forward to today, and she was much less forthcoming.
WhatsApp messages between yourself and Mr Yusuf and Ms Lloyd were produced by you. Where did you get them?
They were provided to me through the Scottish Government.
But did you delete them?
Yes.
Did you consider yourself, against that background and your considerable ministerial experience, to be precisely the right First Minister for the job?
No, that's not how I would have thought of it at all. There's a large part of me wishes that I hadn't been.
All right, then. I'm joined now by Tory MP Lee Anderson. Lee, are those just crocodile tears?
Well, it looks like crocodile tears to me, Patrick. I mean, first we had the missing camper van. Nobody knows where that is. Now we've got this nonsense. We've got these burner phones, dodgy £5 phones from wherever they bought them from, WhatsApp messages going missing. It all looks a little bit dodgy to me. I mean, she's bleating on there, she's crying on screen. This is not cutting no ice. It's crocodile tears. It makes you wonder what the SNPs are all about, Patrick. It looks... I mean, the people that have burner phones, let's be clear, people that have these dodgy phones where you can't trace them and disappearing WhatsApp messages, these are normally criminals, these are drug dealers, and you know what, these SNPs are no better than criminals.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. In Beverley, in East Yorkshire, a charity is playing a crucial role in helping older people to stay connected. Community Lift helps to ferry people around the rural area, making sure that they stay in touch with friends and family and are able to keep up their hobbies. The group has been going since 1970, and as Anna Riley reports, they're on the hunt for new volunteers.
Hello, Steve. Get on the boat. Beverley Community Lift, the charity that's been transporting elderly, disabled and isolated people around East Yorkshire for more than 50 years, providing door-to-door travel for shopping trips, medical appointments and days out. It fills a gap in a rural community where buses are scarce and taxis are costly. Pensioners Mary Webber and Carol Smith depend on the service.
You're out in the boondocks, I keep saying, where I am anyway. There's no transport in Leconfield, except we have no shop, we have no post office. Leconfield's got nothing, no pub even. You don't want to keep asking people to do shopping for you or take you shopping even. And you want to be independent as much as you can. And this gives you independence. It's good for hospital visits. You always know where to drop you, where to go, where to pick you up. So I can't speak highly enough of it. I don't know what I would have done without it.
The charity provides 2,500 subsidised journeys for passengers each year. Its volunteers like Stephen Priestley and Sheila Turnbull are at the heart.
The transport, some of it round here is a bit hit and miss. You can have a good laugh with all the people that you take round, because there's quite a good few characters that you take out and about.
A lot of people on there that sit and chat, and they might not see people from one day to the next. So it gets them about and about and makes me feel like I'm doing something back for the community.
Manager Fiona Wales is calling for more volunteers so that Beverley Community Lift can serve a wider area.
We can't do what we do without the volunteers that we have in place. Without us, you've got an awful lot of people who cannot actually physically leave their own home. As we saw through the pandemic, just how isolating not being able to get out of your own home is. If you live on your own, we're your vital link, really, to be able to access shops, to get to your GP, to meet a friend for coffee, just to get a social life.
This charity is a lifeline for the 450 over 60s that use the service not just for a lift, but also for companionship. Anna Riley, GB News.
Now, that was Anna Riley reporting from Beverley. At 1 o'clock, Dawn Neeson will present her show. Dawn, it's lovely to see you.
Thank you very much. You lie so well. It's lovely to see you. Oh, my God, it's her again. Hello, Michael.
Tell us what's on your show.
It is a cracking show coming up, I have to admit. We are doing fitness testing for older people.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think we.
How do you test it? By making us touch our toes?
Well, you can give us a demonstration if you'd like. No, it involves a beep test. We're talking about people who are serving as police officers in particular and their fitness levels when they get to a certain age, and women of a certain age, because it's all my fault, obviously. We're also talking of fitness, we're talking about young people. And are they slightly more lazier when it comes to work than we are, Michael?
Yes, yes. This whole business of working from home and no longer regarding Friday as a working day and so on.
Yes, and then ghosting interviews. Getting an interview and just not turning up. You'd never have done that back in the day, would you?
Neither back in the day nor now.
Nor now, exactly, because we need people to employ us, don't we? And finally, will Donald Trump deport Harry back here? It's possible. You're laughing, but it is possible.
Be careful what you wish for. You're on at 1 o'clock.
Thank you.
Look forward to it. Still ahead on my programme, Andy Lound will explain the future of space travel as a private company in the United States manages to place a lander on the moon.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
You have a president in President Biden who's not enforcing the law that was passed by Congress. President Obama, criticize him or not, actually enforced the law and was deporting people that had crossed illegally. Of course, President Trump enforced the law and improved the law to make sure that and worked with Mexico to have the Remain in Mexico policy. Biden has abandoned federal policy. In fact, he's deliberately trying to let in as many immigrants as possible. More for the Democrats, more is better and less is racist.
Just astonishing. And the statement that Greg Abbott put out is really feisty stuff. He said the federal government has broken the contract between the United States and the state of Texas. And the eye numbers, Greg, are simply eye-watering. 6 million illegal immigrants have crossed our southern border in just 3 years, Governor Abbott says. That's more than the population of 33 states in the United States. Astonishing numbers.
And Martin, that's just Texas. If you add Arizona and other border states, you know, it's pushing 10 million. By the end of Biden's term, it'll be 11 million. A study by Yale University a few weeks ago, 3 very liberal professors that did the study estimate there's 22 million illegal aliens. So this is a crisis that was created by Biden. It's what he wants. They want unfettered access to the border. They're letting them in. It's a real hardship on the working people of Texas and other border states. And now it's a real hardship on cities that the federal government, as well as the governors of Texas and other states, are sending some of the migrants to those so-called sanctuary cities.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Welcome back. When the United States last reached the moon half a century ago, all the resources of the state had to be marshalled under the banner of NASA. This week, a new lander touched down on the lunar surface, having been built and launched by a private company in Texas. The Odysseus lander carries a dozen scientific experiments, and its adventure is proving as unpredictable as its ancient Greek namesake, since it has toppled over on landing. Andy Lound, the space and planetary scientist, joins me. Hello, Andy, welcome. Is it actually a problem that Odysseus has fallen over?
Good afternoon. Well, it could have been better. It could have been upright. Although in this particular case, it's been very fortunate because the main array of instruments are actually on the side, which are facing upwards. So they got away with it, really. And the only instrument which is which is underneath it is actually an art installation, almost underneath it, so that doesn't need any power. So fortunately, in this particular case, the instruments that they need to use is on the side which is upright, fortunately.
What kind of instruments, what kind of experiments are involved? What does it carry to the moon?
Yeah, this is really quite important. One of the most important experiments on board is a NASA instrument. When Apollo 12 landed on the surface of the moon, it landed fairly close to one of the Surveyor landers, and the idea was to cut pieces of that spacecraft off to bring back to Earth. They noticed that when it landed, it had sandblasted this spacecraft, which was quite some meters away from it. And lunar soil, the regolith, is in fact electrostatic. It can actually move around anywhere. And people look at pictures of the 1972 landing of Apollo 17, will see astronauts covered in all the grey material from the surface, and that's because this material sticks to you. So there's an experiment on board to see if they can negate this kind of static material sticking to people's outfits, and obviously to instruments as well, and to measure really how much dust is kicked up by rockets when they land. Because obviously when you've got a base on the moon and rockets are coming up and down, what you really don't want to do is completely sandblast everything. Very similar, if you like, to helicopters landing in the desert near army bases where you get all this material kicking around. Well, on the moon, that's many times worse. So there's a major experiment to look at that. There's a thermal blanket on board to have a look at new ways of protecting instrumentation when they're on the surface of the moon. And there's an interesting experiment on board. There's a LiDAR, which is a laser ranging finding system, which was absolutely critical in this particular case, because as the spacecraft was coming in to land on the moon, they found out that the onboard guidance system, the rangefinders, wasn't working. So they actually had to do a quick workaround and get them to use the experimental one, which NASA put on board, to actually guide them to the surface, which actually worked really well. So that was a good system in the end that worked quite impressively. There's also laser reflectors on board it. Now, this is really an important experiment because these, of course, don't take any power. They're just sort of a dome with different mirrors on board. And that means this spacecraft, therefore, could act as a beacon to other vehicles coming in, where it would fire lasers down and get bounced back from this vehicle and act as a marker point. In a very similar way, lighthouses are scattered around the coastline. There are also marker points for ships coming in. This spacecraft is actually going to be acting as a marker point for other spacecraft in the future.
I believe that it has landed near to one of the lunar poles. Which one and why?
Yeah, down towards the South Polar region. And the South Polar region of the moon is where the Artemis project, this major project, which is led by the United States but combines loads of other countries as well, including the UK. I must add that one, very important to us, because they're going to aim towards the South Polar region where there is believed to be loads of water ice. And one of the ideas of this is trying to identify water ice in the craters. Water is going to be really important, heavy item to actually carry with you into space. So if you could find water locally, even better. You can take the water ice, you can actually use the water directly, melt it, and you could actually use it for drinking or for cooling systems. You could split it up into hydrogen and oxygen, use the oxygen as an oxidant, use the hydrogen as a fuel. Or then you could take those and recombine them using hydrogen fuel cells, and that would generate water, electricity, and heat. So finding water is absolutely critical, especially if you can find it in situ. There's a lot more water, for instance, that we know about on Mars, for instance, and on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. So there we wouldn't have a problem locating it and getting access to it. The moon is very different. We think it's at the polar regions where the water which has been distributed there, probably from cometary impacts, is shaded from the heat of the sun during the 14 days sunshine that it gets, and therefore stays frozen and pristine. So that would be a great idea. And if you can actually get there and use this water and use the systems there, that would be good practice then for when we go out to places like Mars to actually use the same sort of system. So it'd be acting, if you like, as a practice run, the base on the moon for a practice run for Mars.
Tell me about the significance of this being a private company that has built and launched the satellite.
Yes, because as you very well said, in the early days, this was a state-sponsored program. 4% of the federal budget went into Apollo, so it's a huge amount of money, which they can't really afford to do that kind of thing. Now, it's 0.4% of the federal budget space programs are, but it was the only way of being able to do it at the time because of the risk of developing the technologies, because it was all very, very much cutting edge. Other state sponsors like China, Japan and Russia are still going to be the big sponsors in their countries for doing it, partly because of the structure of their countries in themselves. Although Japan use a very interesting model where state and commercial people really have merged closer than they do in the West. But here, NASA have got a program where they want private companies to develop the technologies themselves, which then NASA can buy in. So in this particular case, it's a lunar lander, and they can put their experiments on board it. The risk and everything is taken by the private company. But the trade-off is that the private company then can offer these services to anybody on the planet. So you and I, if we've got an experiment to put on board this spacecraft, a university say, yeah, we can't afford to invest in a launch system, but can we put this on your vehicle? And they go, yes, we can carry up to 12, 14 experiments. So yes, we can easily put that on board there. And that changes the whole game plan now, because this makes the experimentation capability for everybody across the planet open, get to the moon. And of course, the commercial aspect is brilliant because it brings the price down. And the technology that they developed for this is brilliant because then you can utilize that technology down here on Earth. I mentioned something like the green tech, which is absolutely critical if you're going to go into space because you can't have all these pollutants around. Well, we're desperate for green tech down here on Earth, and this is a good way of developing that technology that can be fed back into our systems down here on Earth. I think you've had things like hydrogen fuel cells, which can be used down here on Earth. That was developed originally in Britain. But you have things like if you're using hydrogen cryogenic systems, you can say, well, we want hydrogen down here on Earth, but we've already developed the cryogenic systems to store it and to transport it for the space program. So now that can be fed into the commercial world down here on Earth. And that's why this is going to be really big. And I think what you'll see is an acceleration of space exploration because of the private sector getting in there.
Andy, I have to ask you to be very brief on this next one because we're coming to the end of the programme. But this alarming story about Russia potentially having a satellite that could use nuclear power to destroy other satellites.
Yeah. Yes, this is a terrible thing. But unfortunately, when the humans go out there, and people like me are very excited and we want to do the exploration thing, we're humans. And when humans go out there, they bring away all the problems with the political issues. And yes, there is a concern of this. The opening of the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, we see three satellites orbiting the Earth. Arthur C. Clarke wrote those as nuclear weapons satellites because he could foresee this as a risk. And this has been going on for some time. 1967 Outer Space Treaty banned the use of nuclear weapons in space, and there was a special agreement on, but that's now gone. But it is a risk. It is a risk.
Andy, thank you very much. That is a very worrying development. On the other hand, the arrival of the new lander on the moon is most promising and most interesting for the reasons that you have explained to us. Thank you very much indeed, Andy Loud. And indeed, thanks to all my guests this morning. That does bring us to the end of today's programme. I will be back at the same time next Sunday. I very much hope that you've enjoyed today's programme. I very much hope that you'll be back with me this time next week. Until then, I say goodbye and look forward to seeing you again.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Jonathan Vautry here with your GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. Southern districts are bearing the brunt of the rainfall today. We've seen it sweeping its way in, some heavy pauses at times, and it will stay very persistent, particularly in the southeast right throughout tonight. With this additional rainfall adding on top of what we've already had this winter, we could see some disruption in places. Elsewhere, some clearer spells for the night, some showers pushing in across Scotland, falling